Hello and welcome to another fun-filled edition of Adam's Music Box. And today we're going to talk about decades. Ooh. Um, and decades, like all time, is both an artificial and annoying human construct, but it's useful because it signposts various actual things that matter to us and that make life interesting. And so I want to talk about decades, or perhaps more appropriately, eras when one domineering genre in the popular music world gives way to another one. And in many ways, I'm going to start with the most recent because, in many ways, the most recent was the 1990s. The 1990s was the era where hip hop and rap were on the rise. And rock, while having a kind of revival because of a new version of rock in the early 90s, it was ultimate the lost stand of rock after being the dominant force in pop music since the 1950s. Now, let's consider why that might be and why certain genres overtake others. You could say that people simply get tired of a single genre, but that's kind of a misnomer because things constantly evolve. The rock and roll of Elvis was different than the rock and roll of the Beatles, Rolling Stones, Animals, Who, and that sort of early to mid 60s era. And that rock and roll was very different than the stuff coming out in the late 60s, the Moody Blues, Pink Floyd, King Crimson, Jethro Tull, Bad Company, Led Zeppelin. Well, was free before Bad Company, but you get the idea. Deep Purple, and that was very different than the rock of the 80s, etc. And the same is true with the pop music. Mario Lanza was different than Bing Crosby, was different than Frank Sinatra, was different than Bobby Darin, but all in that what we now retrospectively call the classic pop of that era. So, um, you can't say that people get tired of a genre that keeps evolving. And so, what really does make one genre fall off and one genre arise to the prominence in the pop world? Well, one argument could be that a new genre comes along that's fun and exciting, but a lot of times that new fun and exciting genre either coexists or is amalgamated into that existing genre. For example, the increased popularity of funk and later disco in the 70s didn't make rock go away, and certain elements were co-absorbed by one another. And the new wave of the 1980s was one reflection of that. Rod Stewart singing If You Like My Body and You Think I'm Sexy was a traditional rock singer embracing disco. They coexisted just as Motown and Stax coexisted with the rock of the 60s and early 70s. And there's many examples of this. Michael Jackson and Van Halen not only coexisting, but collaborating. But what makes certain genres fade into the background? And I think the answer to this lies when they no longer feel fresh and happy. Because while people appreciate music that runs the emotional spectrum, at the end of the day, art for the masses as opposed to art for a segment is all about escapism. It's all about smiling when you otherwise wouldn't, getting out of bed when you'd rather stay in, staying out at night when you'd otherwise be bored. It's the kind of music that makes you happy. And in the early 90s, rock abruptly stopped making people happy. From Elvis right up into Whitesnake in the late 80s, the rock that really sold well and the rock that dominated the pop charts was the rock that made people happy. And then came the early 90s with bands like Nirvana and Pearl Jam and Alice in Chains. Some of these bands more talented than others, but all very dominant. Nirvana generally pointed out as one of the more dominant ones, even though other bands of that genre were actually more talented. And now David Grohl has got a scandal, not as big as the Diddy scandal, but it is kind of interesting to see the people who think they're so squeaky clean end up being just like all the rest of the people. Anyway, um, not that I'm one to judge, but there you go. I'm just reporting the information. Take that. So what happened to rock is it got miserable. It got very grim. It got very melancholic. And there was a market for it because at the time that was new, that was novel. We're no longer having Tony Katane do a striptease on the front of an expensive Jaguar. You're sort of staring down at your detuned guitar, talking about how miserable you are. But that music eventually faded away. It did enough damage to happy rock to put all of the rock and roll sort of genre in jeopardy, but the grunge stuff itself maybe lasted 3 or 4 years at most. Now, what was the new genre that was arising in the 90s? Well, it wasn't really new because it had origins going back to the 70s, but the fresh version of hip hop, with all of its innovation in sampling that was going on in the early 90s and sonic structure and the ever more direct and explicit and shocking in some cases and still conscious at many times lyrics, hip hop and rap in particular was well on its way to becoming a dominant genre that would influence everything else. And the reason for it is even when the rap was talking about serious issues, Little Ghetto Boy by Dr. Dre, not a very sunshine and lollipop song, but it's the overall ethos of the music, how it makes you feel. The hip hop of the early 90s made you want to cruise down the street in your 6'4". I know that's the 80s, but obviously the symbol of the 64 Chevy Impala was very much still a part of the West Coast hip hop that dominated in the early and mid 90s. It made you want to do that. It made you want to hang out with people. Ice Cube's It Was a Good Day sort of goes down all of the things that would happen on a hypothetical good day in his community. But the point is, even when the hip hop of the 90s was dealing with heavy and serious subject matters, there was still humor in it. There was still something you could smile to. There was something you could nod your head to. In many cases, something you could dance to. Not true with the rock of the early 90s. And if you can't smile and can't dance and can't sort of have some positive escapism, the music will eventually fade. And we see now that hip hop not only came to dominate, but the hip hop sound impacted the pop sound so that now subsequent to the 1990s, regular old sort of singer based pop music started using sampling, started using hip hop beats, started to sound like hip hop in the same way that after the arrival of Elvis and Chuck Berry and the Beatles later and the Rolling Stones, the mainstream pop music eventually started to sound more like rock. And even traditional pop singers like Andy Williams and Frank Sinatra started covering songs by rock artists in a very big way. It became the dominant force. And in the 90s, hip hop did. And this isn't to say that these rock bands of the 90s weren't influential. They still obviously have their fans, but I'll put it this way. Um, about 2 years ago, it was the Super Bowl when the Rams were playing the Bengals in LA. The second Super Bowl in the row where the home team was in their home venue. Very unusual. But what wasn't unusual was the fact that quintessential West Coast hip hop from the 90s was the halftime show, and it stole the show. Everybody loved it. And if you were to look at the rock music of the 90s, when The Chronic came out, when Doggy Style came out a year later, when at the end of the 90s, 2001, which was really released in 99, came out that brought Dre and Snoop Dogg back together post Death Row, the rock throughout that time, if you were to put that music on stage at the Super Bowl, it wouldn't have had that same effect. Now, when rock was at its finest, you could put the most popular rock band of the day at the Super Bowl, even years later, and people would still dance to it. If you put Whitesnake or Deep Purple at the Super Bowl and they play, Deep Purple playing Smoke on the Water, people, even those who weren't around for it, they would still nod their head, dance around, rock to it. Same with Led Zeppelin, any of these big rock bands. And that is sort of an interesting way to test whether something has longevity or not. If you can picture it at a public event that isn't directly associated with music and people like it. Think some civic event, think a politician's fundraiser, a Super Bowl, another sports game, a local sports game, an international sports game. And if people can sort of vibe with the music, that's a kind of music that's here to stay. If they can't, then it's a kind of music that even if it was at the top of the charts at one time, it's not the kind of music with staying power. Miserable music just doesn't stand the test of time. That's my take anyway. Let me know what you think in the comments. Remember to share this new channel, like, subscribe. We will see you next time. Take care.